Hello guys and welcome back. Today's video is the first video of a new series that I will be starting on the channel, and that is a top 5 series for the Lord of the Rings Total War mod for Rome Remastered. And starting off this series, we're going to be doing a video going over the top 5 defendable cities in the game based on 3 criteria that I think are a pretty good way to measure this due just how battles are kind of set up and played in Rome Remastered and then thusly the mod itself. So let's just jump in and quickly talk about these criteria that I again have come up with. It's not it's not set in stone, but these are just the ones that I've personally just think fit really well. So the first one being what I call M&M. It's just missiles and melee, meaning can can a settlement use both units to defend itself? Because in older Total War titles, like Rome Total War, Rome Remastered, Medieval 2. I guess not as much as Medieval 2, but Rome Remastered. More balanced armies are really effective in the game because you don't have single entities like these newer Total War titles have, where you can place a single entity out front and just let your missiles essentially hit nothing but the enemy. If you spam only melee units, you have no missile support, and if you just do missile units, then you're just going to get steamrolled by the enemy charging you. So you need a little bit of both, and so that's just a criteria that I thought was really valuable because you want to be able to use both units to defend your cities. The second being, how well the city negates an enemy's playstyle advantage. For example, elves use missiles. Orcs mostly use numbers, and monster entities, Rohan uses cav, that kind of stuff. So really, how well does a custom settlement or a settlement in general take that advantage and strip it away? How weak can it make that advantage for the enemy? Because if you take away a faction's strength, it makes the battle so much easier. And you really need to have that in a siege. And then lastly, it's just really basic, but just how easy is it and how much effort do you have to put in to actually win the siege? Do you constantly have to be reforming? Do you constantly have to be telling your units, to brace, to use the rally button, to ceasefire, fire at will, that kind of thing? Just how much actual attention do you have to pay to the siege to win? With all that being said, we're going to jump into the number 5 top 5 video, starting with number 5. And you may have guessed it just from looking here in the background, but it is a elven settlement, and it is Rivendell. Don't get me wrong, even though it is number 5 in the top 5 video for sieges in the game, it's still a really good settlement and easy settlement in my opinion to defend. It's just when it compares to the other 4, it just falters a little bit here, and we'll talk about that. One thing I will recommend, and I will actually cover it also in another video, is at this point in the mod, do not fight on the walls. There is a pretty big issue at the moment that I have found pretty much across any custom settlement that kind of has like a barricade like that. But I will go into that in another top 5 video that I will release later on. But talking about Rivendell now. Can it use missile and melees? Yes. Mainly because of the choke point battle, or the choke point location here because of the bridge. Because it's the only way to access the town center, which, if you're familiar with older titles involving Total War, the AI really likes to push for the town center when it comes to sieges, and this is the only way that they can get here. They can't come around this backside. It's walled off. They can't climb up this mountain or cliff here. So the only way they can get up here is going through this bridge. And so because of that, it creates something that I've kind of started calling like a Death Valley, which it's a tactic I used in Rome 1, where I would take the militia hop flights, for example, like with the Greek city-states, and I would win against Roman armies because of this type of formation, where you kind of make a V with your forces, So essentially what happens is the enemy will funnel in here, right? And they'll pull up because they will hit these infantry units and they'll get into combat. While that's going on, your archer units will be shooting into this lovely little hole here that's been created by this V, because the enemy will essentially circle up because they can't push through here because their unit card will be hitting my units here just because they're sheer numbers. So like if I'm formed like this or formed like that, you know, they're going to be bumping into my enemy or my troops, and so they're going to be like caught and stuck basically. So it gives your missile units to shoot into a nice juicy blob here. Not to mention, more likely than not, playing, you know, the siege of Rivendell, you're going to be a elven faction. And with elves, if we look at their range, they have 180 range. And as you can see here, they're basically shooting the whole distance of this bridge anyway. So not only are you going to have a nice, fat, juicy blob sitting right here where you can shoot your missiles into, but you're going to be shooting into a fairly condensed pathway the entire time. So really, really effective map in terms of being able to use both units, which is a really valuable, very valuable play style in the mod. Secondly, it does a really good job of negating basically any enemy that you may go up against and their advantages. For example, if they just have melee infantry, dwarves even, because elven infantry, I know this is like the high tier spearman unit, an infantry unit for the elves, but some of the elven melee units can go toe to toe with the dwarven units in terms of not only their stats, but their morale, their hit points, their abilities, and everything like that. So really, really strong. Obviously, the settlement itself is going to limit, you know, I have Mordor here set up. It's going to limit Mordor's advantage of just spamming, you know, thousands and thousands of troops at you, because despite them, you know, I may only have a couple hundred troops here and they could have 4,000, but all of that 4,000 has to come right through here. They can't loop around, they can't flank me. Their only choice is to come right through this little thin gap. So it does a really good job of limiting mass numbers. It does a good job of, you know, denying monsters and cav charges, because both of those need time to cycle charge. They need the space to reform and then recharge again, and you don't have that. You don't have the space to reform on a tiny bridge and then to cycle charge again. So again, it, you know, in terms, if you want to give it a letter grade, both of the melee and missiles and the enemy advantage, it gets an A. It does a really good job. However, the ease of defensiveness and, you know, just the amount of effort it takes to win can be a little tricky here. It's not by much compared to Rivendell and the number 4 settlement. Mainly, it's just even though your elven units can, you know, they're okay in melee. It's not that I recommend sending them into melee after using their ammo. But one issue is, you know, since it is a fairly small area to move around here, relatively speaking, you know, compared to other maps, once they, you know, this initial, say I had like 6 more missile units, right? And all these units here waste, or, you know, go through all their ammo. You have to take the time to reform them, get them out of the way safely, and then bring those units in. And while you're doing that, which obviously you can pause it, I personally try not to pause it because I want to improve my micro. So just assuming that you're not pausing it and playing constantly throughout a siege, you're going to have to take the time to then, you know, kind of turn away and reform back here so you can bring units in, and you're just your eyesight and like your focus is just taken away from your melee infantry holding the line. So it does provide a sort of a window for the enemy to actually break through your line while you're reforming, and if that happens and you don't have time to set up again, it can actually ruin the siege for you. But it's just very unlikely with elves just because they are so strong, but it can happen. So it's just something to look out for. Um, and in terms of just Rivendell's strengths, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but it's got two big ones. Because outside of the criteria, I've also made kind of a small list of kind of the pros of a siege. A siege or a settlement, actually not a siege, the settlement itself. And the reason why it's number 5 and not say number 3 or 2 is because I have other ones that have more pros to them than Rivendell is all. It's still a really good siege. It's just not as good as others. Mainly being it really only has like the duo of the choke point and the Death Valley, where a nice blob is going to form here. They have a small choke point, a very small pathway to travel behind, but that's really it. They don't have a hill that the enemy is fighting up. They don't have more than one choke point. They don't have more than one like area where you can get the enemy to blob up, that kind of thing. They don't have like the war of attrition where your enemy, the enemy is just fighting against you over time and making them tired. So it's fairly limited into that regard. But overall, Rivendell, really good siege and a really good settlement to defend, and really fun to defend as well. So with that being said, let's move on to number 4. Number 4, as you guys can probably guess, it is Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith is a really fun one to fight, not only for kind of the nostalgia of the movies and everything, but really it's just a really fun and interesting custom siege map in general, just because of the city layout of Minas Tirith. It's really fun, really interesting. But without further ado, let's go into why it is a top 5 defensive siege map. Mainly being it can use melee and missile units just like any of these top 5 settlements should be able to do. You have areas on all the levels of Minas Tirith that allow you to use missile units firing into the enemy. They have good points where you can spread your troops out and make a good barricade. You can set up your troops here, like for missiles, to shoot down on the enemy in case you forget to reform and your initial enemy on the base level gets attacked. So you can be constantly pelting the enemy as they're marching towards you, or you can go with a melee unit and put them in a prime position. Whether it's fighting going up the hill against the enemy, where the enemy is coming up against you up the hill, or just at a good choke point here. And the same goes, you can, in terms of like what levels you should put what units on, it's really up to you. You could put melee infantry here and missile units here. It really just depends, up to you. But it allows you to use both types of units, and that's a really valuable thing for a siege, and not only a siege but battles in general, because just like in the Rivendell video where I talked about, you want to be able to use both types of units in the game, because you need both types of units to have successful armies. It also negates the enemy playstyle advantage, being if you're playing as Gondor, more likely than not, Mordor is going to be your main enemy, and they may attack Minas Tirith. And Mordor's advantage is its high numbers. And I also play on ultra unit scale. I know that's not going to be for everybody. People will change, but I feel for the most part it still applies here. But as you can see here, like this unit here has 101 units in its unit card, and this red here is telling me that I cannot, make that formation. So I basically have to go fairly narrow here to put that in, and that's with 100 units. So an orc unit that has 240, they're just not going to be able to use their sheer numbers to overpower you. Obviously, your spearmen of Gondor here, their stats are just superbly better than an orc unit, but it makes those stats even stronger when only say 5 units of your troops are fighting 5 units of theirs, and so on. It's so on and so forth in terms of the battle progression. And so it does a very, very, very good job of limiting and you know, your main enemy's threat. Same if it's cavalry. You know, cavalry are not going to charge well going uphill in these tight little spaces. Cavalry need, you know, room to spread around. Same with trolls in terms of cycle charging. Archers, you know, if we zoom in down here, you know, if I'm an archer unit sitting right here, like they don't have a line of sight to shoot up there. So it's a really strong defensive city in that regard because it defends well against anything. However, it's only number 4 in my ranking because it is kind of, in terms of ease of defensiveness, excuse me, and the amount of effort you kind of need to put in to win. It's a little more extensive than the last 3 remaining sieges, but it is a little bit less intensive than Rivendell in my opinion, because again in the Rivendell video you have a very small area that you can move units around, whereas Minas Tirith you definitely have the capability to move around more. However, as you can see here, when I'm moving like up, you know, as the battle goes on, and say you're losing and you need to reform, as I'm going up, you don't really have great like line of sight to reform your units. So it's really hard. I mean, you obviously can pause the battle and reform, but if you don't want to do that and want to help improve your micro, it's just really hard to get a good angle here to reform your units. So it's just a little trickier, as you go up higher into the settlement here to reform your unit. So that's where it kind of loses some points for me anyway. But other than that, it's really good. And really, I have 2 big points for Minas Tirith, sort of like Rivendell's being the massive choke point and the Death Valleys. Minas Tirith has 2, and that is its multiple levels and just the concept of the war of attrition, where you may have some lower tier infantry, even less than Spearmen of Gondor, going up against, you know, 3,000 to 4,000 units of Mordor or whoever it may be, Isengard, Orc rabble, who knows, you know, what could be happening in your campaign. But because, you know, the AI has to come up here at such a weird angle to come up and attack, they're also fighting uphill, you know, most of the time, depending on where you're placing your units, or they're sprinting up the hill and then fighting you where you've just been sitting here. So your units are going to be fresh, their units, are going to be exhausted, and so it's just a war of attrition where, you know, if the AI gets all the way to the top and manages to beat you, you know, I'm thinking like, you know, 6,000 to 8,000 troops minimum against maybe this army here that may beat you. Even this army maybe even to repel that, because I mean that is what we got: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 levels to get up and capture the town center if it would ever get to that point. So it really, in terms of a war of attrition, it may be the strongest in terms of war of attrition, just because, I mean, I know personally, if I'm attacking Minas Tirith, it is a pain in the ass to win. Your units take massive damage. You cannot bring one army here versus one army. It just does not work. So because of those things, you know, the fact that Minas Tirith can use missiles and melee, great, gets an A+ there. Gets another A+ because it negates basically any enemy playstyle's advantage, whether it's infantry, missiles, cavalry, and monster entities. It just does a really good job of getting rid of those, but it kind of falls behind on the ease of use. Excuse me, I keep messing that one up. Ease of use, and just overall the amount of effort that you kind of need to put in, because it is very likely that you may get overrun on certain levels and you need to reform. And unfortunately, as much of a pain it may be for the AI to move up the walls, it's going to be the same difficulty for you in terms of reforming, just because of you just don't get a good line of sight when you're moving up the tiers here. But with that being said, let's go on to the number 3 siege settlement. Number 3 here, as you guys may be able to guess it, is Rohan, and it is actually not Helm's Deep, but Edoras. Edoras is very unique because it's actually the first custom siege map in the game that actually has 3 really big pros to it, unlike Rivendell and Minas Tirith that only have 2. But let's start with the criteria first, as always. Obviously, it's able to use missiles and melee, because if we zoom in here, we're able to hold back the enemy at the front gates here, or for example, if they were to go over to this gate here, we're able to hold them back, and obviously have a really good line of sight shooting downhill into the enemy. Really good, really effective, especially in the old Total War titles. Fighting and shooting downhill actually provides a bonus, I believe, to the damage of your missile units. It's kind of like a hidden like buff stat. So obviously in both scenarios here, really useful, really handy, just to provide that to your units. And like the previous two, it also negates the enemy's advantages really well, and it does a good job of negating all 3, whether it's infantry, missile units, some more cav coming at you, or monster entities. It does a good job of getting rid of them all. If it's missile based armies coming at you, you can get into melee with them, or if it's melee, you have great line of sight going all the way up this hill here. Hypothetically, if they were all coming through this gate, you could stack your archers all the way up this hill here, shooting down into the enemy as the fight progresses. Any cav units obviously don't have any area to reform or charge, same way with trolls or anything like that. So it does a really good job of just shutting down the enemy's options. The only way through is through brute force, and that's if they survive volleys and volleys of arrows coming at them. And then lastly, in terms of ease of use, and just the amount of effort you really need to put in, it does definitely, it's an improvement from the previous two, but it's definitely not great. Mainly for one big reason that you guys may be able to see is if you do get overrun, as effective as these choke points are, if your choke point fails and you need to reform, especially how narrow and tight this one is, it's really great when it works for you. But if you do need to reform, it's going to be very difficult to get your units back up the hill. However, one very cool thing is that it actually provides you, and at Edoras anyway, another opportunity for the enemy to fight uphill against you. So, you have you kind of like your base level down here on that side. Same thing over down here. But to get up here, they have 2 more hills that the enemy have to climb up. So even if these units, say you sacrifice 1 unit and get more up here, it provides you a really good opportunity to then reform and to set yourself up, either doing the same strategy here with some infantry and then missile units firing down, or just coming up here, and putting some units, say like right here, and holding them back, and then kind of making a small death valley, shooting into the sides of the enemy right there. So definitely gets like an A for the use of melee and missiles, an A of negating the enemy's advantages really of any faction. And in terms of the amount of effort and defensiveness, I'd probably give it like a B, or a B minus, something like that, just because there are so many choke points here, as well as the first time we actually see this in the video is uphill fighting. It's not that big of a thing anymore in newer games for Total War, but in older ones like Rome 2, Medieval 2, those kind of older games, fighting uphill is a deadly tactic as the attacker. Your units as the defender, your units are going to defend much better, because they're not running up a hill, they're saving their stamina So you're fighting, your vigor or stamina, however you want to call it, in terms of melee. Like your melee units, even though they may be weaker than the enemies technically in terms of stats, they'll fight. Their crappy stats basically will last longer than the enemy's really good stats because they're not the ones charging up a hill. They're not sprinting and trying to do, say if they're a shock infantry unit, you can't use shock infantry up here, but the AI won't know that. So uphill fighting, it's the first time we see it. It's really, really useful, really great to have. And then like the other two at Rivendell and Minas Tirith, it has either choke points, death valleys, or a war of attrition, where, if you want to go, really, if you wanted to go all melee infantry to defend Edoras, you could, and just win by war of attrition, where, you could stack, if I just briefly show you guys here, you could just stack melee infantry on top of each other, and maybe... Oh, you get the point here. On this uphill, you could do it over there, or you could just simply do it at these two here. That way it's a little quicker to reinforce each other if you needed to, and just win by war of attrition, where the enemy is just so freaking tired racing up this hill to attack you that your units just slaughter them because their units have no stamina to fight by the time they get to you. But if you want to do with a more balanced build, kind of like with what I have put here in this custom battle, you can have some infantry set up here, which this is a bit overkill, but obviously something you could do. But then you have, essentially a death valley in each of these, where got a good old blob formation here, and they're shooting downhill into the blob on multiple levels, and the enemy is just constantly being pelted there. So Edoras, number 3 I think is a good place for it, because number 1 and number 2 are just insanely good. But overall, it's definitely an improvement from Rivendell and Minas Tirith, in my opinion. Mainly because it adds in the uphill fighting, which I know Minas Tirith had it, but not to this extent. Minas Tirith plateaus quite often once it gets to the levels, which, as you can see here in Edoras, it is a straight uphill climb the entire way. So really good defensive city. Again, I cannot emphasize it enough. If you get a chance to fight one of these battles, highly recommend doing it. Whether you're the defender or the attacker on a campaign map and you lose even as the attacker, just to kind of experience it, in my opinion, is really cool. But without further ado, and enough elaborating, let's go on to the second most defensive settlement in the game. The number 2 most defensive city is Barad-dûr. The dreaded, if we can zoom in or zoom out here a little bit, the dreaded tower of the Eye of Sauron here, which I don't know if I can actually... There we go. Yeah, you can kind of see it. There he is. a little blurred out. But yeah, it's the Barad-dûr. Really fun settlement to defend. I'm really impressed with the siege settlement here, or the custom settlement actually. It's really well done. Obviously, starting with the 3 criteria, you can obviously easily use missiles and melee, which is really good. You got beautiful opportunities to make some choke points and some death valleys here. Making the V formation, shooting into the blob here. Doing the same thing in here, which is why I made some groups. And if the AI were to punch through your first one, you can also do it over here, which I totally realize that orc archers are not the greatest in terms of range, but missile units in the game are really good, regardless if they're an orc archer or they're a elven archer. All of them are good. It's just that some of them are better, and no archer unit in the game is not worth recruiting, in my opinion. So far, I have not gone into a battle and been like, oh, this unit of 120 orc archers only got me 20 kills. You do have to be a little more particular as to what they're shooting. You can't just shoot into heavily armored troops, but again, assuming you're picking your targets a little more effectively, they'll still do their worth. Secondly, they negate any enemy advantage, really, for some several reasons. Obviously, the area back here is out of the previous 3 siege maps anyway, and it has the biggest potential for cavalry, cycle charging and whatnot. But for that to happen, they have to punch through this choke point. They have to punch through this choke point. They have to, potentially punch through this one, which if the enemy never sends troops around this way, then you just bring those troops over here to then reinforce this region, or vice versa. If they go over there and try and loop around, you just send some more units over there. So even though it does have the opportunity for that, it's just very, very unlikely that the AI will actually push through and get to that point. Whether it's they either get to that point or in a healthy enough state to actually cycle charge, it's just very unlikely that that is going to happen. And in terms of the amount of effort needed to win, you may have to do some reforming, just because more likely than not, if you're defending Barad-dûr, you're going to be Mordor because that's who has it from the get-go. And just because orc morale is not the greatest, it's more likely that you will have to reform. But the thing is, you're not going uphill, you're not running terribly far. It's very close to your other units, so if you need to reform, it's very easy to do so. You have the protection from your other units, fairly close by to you. So it's really convenient to reform just because of how quick it is to reform in this certain settlement here. Like Edoras, it does have 3 big bonuses going for it at this siege or this battle map. Even though it doesn't have a uphill fight for the enemy, it does have really strong walls. So Barad-dûr and the number 1 settlement, and Minas Tirith has them too. But these walls like this, I've tested it out with artillery. If the artillery is able to shoot walls into this, for example, I tested all the custom battle maps that you can do, and for example, at the Black Gate, I used all of my ammunition from one artillery piece, from one not the ballista, but I can't think of the other artillery piece, the one that shoots the giant boulders. You guys will have to help me out with the name of that one maybe later in the comments. But I wasted all my ammo, and I only did like 60% damage to one wall. So, unless you're bringing 5 or 6 artillery pieces just so you can attack right away and you're not building siege equipment, I mean, you're wasting a lot of, ammunition, balance of power, if you want to call it balance of power, just to destroy one piece of wall when you could just build a siege tower that gets rid of that. But sometimes the enemy will recruit artillery, and they if they have artillery, they will use it. They will waste that ammo. So it kind of is a coin toss-up, excuse me. Holy cow. Whether or not they attack you right away or actually build the equipment they need. But, if the coin goes in your favor and they don't build any, siege equipment, and they waste their ammo and don't create a breach, then you automatically win. So, you never know, it could happen. But it's a possibility. Secondly, they technically have 4 choke points. 2 being at the settlement gates here, over there, and over here. I just didn't have enough units to put over here. But you can tell you could put this formation I have here over there, and it would work. And then the other 2 here are at the very small bridges here. So in terms of choke points, it's the out of the top 5 settlements here, it will have the most. So it's really powerful. It really, again, it helps the lower grade and the lower tier units here, hit above their pay grade, and sort of speaking, where it puts them in a really good position to do more damage than they typically would. And with the choke points, it also creates those death valleys, that I've talked about previously at the last 3 settlements here. Again, you got 4 of them, just like the choke points. And even if you need to reform, if you don't use all your ammo in the first location, no worries. You get to bring them back here and shoot into another juicy blob. So with that, having 4 choke points, potentially, I just find it really unlikely that the AI would send a lot of force over there, but you never know. Because they have so many choke points, a lot of it is the war of attrition, where it's just beating down the enemy, where, alright, the enemy may, get through here, take a good amount of damage, but win. Then they got to do the exact same thing here, where they bring the troops over here, or you bring your reinforcements over here. You're just constantly beating down the enemy. So because of those three big advantages that Barad-dûr has, that's why I put it at number 2. It just doesn't quite have what the number 1 settlement has. But with that being said, let's jump on into number 1 and see what the top rated defensible city in the Lord of the Rings Total War mod is. Lastly, the number 1 easily defendable settlement in the game, in my opinion, is Minas Morgul, as you can tell. Sorry, I had to finish swallowing my water. Really, hands down, a great settlement. Really well done. In terms of the 3 criteria again, you're able to use your melee and missile units. You got some beautiful choke points up here at the gate. Hint, hint, once they fixed a certain issue, you got another choke point here that you're able to fire into. You just have to be careful of the towers, because siege towers in the game do fire back at you, and they're actually pretty deadly. So it's just something to kind of be on the lookout for. But assuming you'd go with a tactic like this, they won't be firing at you. They get through the gate. They funnel right into this choke point, and your archers are firing. You got a choke point here where your archers can fire. They have a second wall, which no other map in the game has something like this. However, as you can see, some of my entities, even though I haven't started the battle, have died. So you do need to be very careful in terms of setting up your units and making sure they do not overlap, and that they actually have enough space to set up, because your units will die if you don't do so. For example, if I do that, or it should anyway, it did, I promise. Now I look like a fool, but so just be aware of that. But it's the first time you see something like this, in a defensive siege, where if you do the V choke point, and then the death valley, as I call it, it works really well, don't get me wrong, but this is a really interesting kind of game-changing factor, where you can actually just kind of blob up and get the enemy to, if you blob up, the enemy blobs up, makes a nice juicy blob right there. How many more times can we say the word blob, eh? And it just gives, in this case, I can have, 4 units of archers, right? Yeah, 4 units of archers, shooting right into a juicy area right there. Not to mention, even if the enemy plows through there, they can just turn around and shoot right back down into here with another volley of archers, or another unit of archers shooting into the area right here. So it's really, really useful. I haven't tested it out in terms if you just defend this area, because you can defend, you can have this set up like this right here, as well as over there, and not even, just basically letting the enemy take the first gate, because, in terms of the other two criteria, it still negates enemies' advantages that they may have. Melee units, whether it's flanking or high damage or just sheer numbers, they're gonna get funneled into these small choke points like this. Cav can only really reform and keep cycle charging in this giant area out here, which is why it could very well be viable to not even defend this area, because if they do punch through, they can loop around and charge into you. Because I can shift and drag here, I can show you that they can actually do that. However, once they get in here, there's really not a whole lot of room for them, to get away, to cycle charge, without your unit or a unit being able to turn around and fight them, or in this case an archer unit shooting them. They're not going to get away with it cleanly. And then the amount of effort, I mean, unless you would put units up here that you would have to kind of get out of the way once the siege towers start kind of doing damage to your units on the walls. It's very similar to Barad-dûr, where if you try and hold the front line here, sure, you're gonna have to bring some units back, but again, because of this second wall, it's one of the few settlements in the game where as you're reforming, you're actually still doing damage to the unit. Because obviously in open field battles, if you're reforming your missile units, they're not firing. And here, even though you're reforming a handful, your other archer units are shooting them, causing more damage to the enemy. Which brings us also to the benefit of the War of Attrition, where it provides you the opportunity to just constantly be doing damage to the enemy, even when a bulk of your army is actually reforming. It just, in any situation, if you're being overrun and you need to reform, it's okay, you're still doing damage. The AI may be doing damage to you too, but it's not just one or the other. You're still doing damage to them. And if they get through here, okay, no big deal. They have to punch through here, or they have to punch through over there, and they have to punch through here. So it's really just, you're just constantly bashing the enemy while they're trying to push through here. It's a really fun siege. Unfortunately, playing as Gondor, you're going up against, in my opinion, the number 1 and number 2 hardest settlements to take. But the good thing is it's just a game, and so if you do lose as the attacker, it's something you can learn. You can see what the AI does, how they defend it, because the AI is more likely than not going to put units up on the walls, and that's okay. But again, it's just, even if you lose, you're going to learn something from it, and if you're defending, you just get to sit back and relax and just watch the carnage kind of just take its due course. But with that all being said, that is the top 5 settlements in the game that I believe are the most defendable in the mod at this moment. Let me know what you guys think. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content. If you enjoyed the video, let me know. Especially in the comments below, let me know what you think, if you've had a chance to play the mod, whether you agree with me or disagree, or what settlements you think could be in the top 5. And with that being said, I do want to kind of put a side note that the other 2 settlements that I almost considered putting in there was Caras Galadhon, which is the Elves of Lothlorien custom battle map, and Helm's Deep. The problem there is Helm's Deep, if you go into it, I'm not going to do it now, but if you go into it, it's just very condensed and pretty much gives you no opportunity to reform, which it's very likely in sieges at some point you're going to have to reform, and in Helm's Deep you just basically don't have the opportunity to. So whatever formation you decide with, you're kind of just rolling with it and you hope you win. And then with the Karis Galadhon settlement, you can't use missile units because of how it's formed. It has a lot of choke points, and being elves, your melee units will do, they can do a lot of damage, but it's even more restricted in terms of reforming capabilities. And so if hypothetically, if this orc spearman unit was a elvish unit and it's getting wrecked and you need to get it out of there and replace it with one, you're not going to be able to do it. It's just very difficult to reform and set yourself up for success in those two. They're still really good, they're still really defendable, but just didn't quite make the cut in the top 5. But other than that, I'm going to wrap it up there. Let me know what you guys think. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you guys again soon with another top 5 video coming out in the next couple of days. Until then, be safe, stay healthy, and have a good one, guys. Bye.